In part 1 we brought you the first half of our top 10 spookiest places that you can go in Europe on a budget. As you know, mini breaking is a load of fun. You can spend very little money and spend a few days in a new town or new city exploring some of the new sights that there is to see. Let's get straight into the second half of our countdown at number 5, Edinburgh. Scotland's capital. For nearly 600 years since taking the royal crown from Dunfermline, Edinburgh is actually only the second most populated city in Scotland. It's nearly half the size of Glasgow. Nearly 3 million visitors will flock here every year, shopping on Princess Street, wandering around the Royal Mile, or visiting the famous castle at the top of the hill. Most people will arrive by train, as this sits on the East Coast Main Line, with trains directly bringing visitors up from London, Newcastle, York and of course Glasgow to the west. Edinburgh's most famous ghost is said to be that of George Mackenzie, a man loyal to the crown who was responsible for overseeing the imprisonment and torture of thousands of Covenanter rebels in the Greyfriars Kirkyard. Check out our video from earlier in the year when we went face to face with this brute. He was later buried in the same graveyard in 1691. His ghost is said to have been disturbed by a homeless man breaking into the mausoleum, and since 1998, more than 600 people have claimed to have been attacked inside a section of the kirkyard, locked off to the public for safety reasons. Should you be silly enough to risk injury yourself, City of the Dead are a tour company that will take you inside if you are brave enough. Do watch the video that we recorded earlier in the year when we spent the night alone in the world's most haunted graveyard. Overcrowding in Edinburgh became an issue, particularly in the already cramped tenements of apartments lining the cobbled streets. Poor sanitary conditions resulted in widespread disease, specifically outbreaks of cholera during the 18th and 19th centuries. Many of these people attempted to seek shelter in the slum areas under the South Bridge, which is also home to the Edinburgh Vaults, a series of chambers built into 19 arches of the bridge, established in 1788. It soon became home to many predators, namely body snatchers. Hidden from view, the vaults provided a perfect place for crime to occur and bodies to be kept. The vaults were prone to flooding and eventually were sealed up until one day a man by the name of Norrie Rowan, who owned a bar on the South Bridge, discovered a section of medieval street below his property, and soon an entire underground labyrinth. One of the most famed ghosts down there is Mr. Boots, an evil entity who is believed to have murdered a woman and kept the body in his house inside. He hates people who tour the vaults and allegedly gets angry or even attacks anyone who dares to sit in the spot where the body was hidden. The most common reports of his presence, however, are the sounds of thick, heavy boots stepping ever so slowly around visitors. The aristocrat is a well-to-do gentleman with a tall black hat and a beard, who is often seen leaning against the walls between the double-height room and the tavern. Arms folded, he watches and grins at people as they pass. Though not an outwardly mean spirit, his presence is reportedly quite sinister. Other ghosts of the vaults include a gobbler from the 1700s, as well as invisible entities that will hold visitors' hands or even tug at their clothing. The Edinburgh Playhouse opened in 1929 as a cinema and is now the UK's largest working theatre. Like all theatres, the Playhouse is said to have its very own ghost, known as Albert. Staff have reported sightings of a man wearing grey on the 6th floor of the theatre, whose appearances are apparently accompanied by a blast of cold air. Albert's living identity is unknown, though he is thought to be the ghost of a stagehand who died in an accident, or a night watchman who is said to have killed himself in the theatre. Edinburgh's most famous landmark has been the Royal Castle since the 12th century, and it has its fair share of conflict too, so it's no real shock that the castle is said to be haunted, with the most famous being a piper blasting his bagpipes. He was supposedly sent into the tunnels under the castle a few hundred years ago to explore, but never returned. There have been multiple reports of bagpipes being heard below the castle, and even in the Royal Mile ever since. The castle dungeons are also said to house a few supernatural entities who were tortured and perished while imprisoned there many years ago. One prisoner who attempted to escape in a wheelbarrow full of dung supposedly haunts the battlements and tries to push visitors down the castle rock. Several have claimed that the spirit's lingering bad smell gives him away every time. Plague victims were quarantined and left to die in Mary King's Close, which was built over and abandoned for many years. When Edinburgh residents eventually returned to the Close, the eyewitness accounts of supernatural sightings and the paranormal occurrences came thick and fast, and even today visitors to the underground street claim to see the ghostly figures and hear eerie voices while there. If these ghosts don't freak you out, try a bit of haggis in Scotland. That certainly will. Number 4. Rome. There are many stories of Roman ghosts around the world. We mentioned some in part 1 in New York. But as the Roman Empire was huge, but none more so than the capital itself, currently Italy's capital, Rome was once nicknamed the capital of the world and sees between 7 and 10 million tourists a year who can enjoy its ancient architecture, some going back over 3,000 years. The Vatican City itself is its own recognised country and the epicentre of the Roman Catholic Church. Even if you're not religious, St. Peter's Basilica dominates the skyline and is very impressive. Throw a coin into the famous Trevi Fountain, gaze up at the Pantheon, wander around the many piazzas, or even get a selfie next to the Colosseum, one of the 7 wonders of the world. And that's where we're going to start. Places of mass death are always going to be linked to the paranormal, but thousands and thousands of slaves, gladiators, animals and prisoners were killed in this very arena. Stand inside it and it's hard to imagine that an estimated 50,000 people could fit into this place, baying for blood, but that's exactly what it was like during the Roman Empire. Gladiators would fight, prisoners would be executed, and all for public entertainment. It's no surprise that people have reported hearing growls, hearing screams, and seeing shadows in the underground tunnels below this place. Cold spots are always regularly felt here. When visiting, watch out for touts trying to oversell pricey fees though. They will charge you a lot extra to go higher in the Colosseum itself, in the structure, but it's not worth the money. The basic entry fee gets you inside, and there's plenty of good photo ops and selfie spots around the base of the Colosseum. Also in the heat, watch out for people trying to sell you bottled water. It sounds like a bargain when you're hot to quench your thirst, but all they're doing is filling up empty bottles from the free water taps dotted all over Rome, then making money by flogging it to sunburnt tourists. Nero was the last Roman emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. After Nero committed suicide while fearing assassination in 68 AD, he was buried on Pincian Hill, which overlooks the Piazza del Popolo. Legend has it that after his death, he took the form of black crows and feasted with witches and demons in a nearby walnut tree. In the 11th century, in an attempt to chase away Nero's troublesome ghost, Pope Paschal II had the tree cut down and a chapel built in its place. If you visit the church of Santa Maria del Popolo in the hope of catching a glimpse of the emperor, however, you'll be disappointed, as the Pope's plan seems to have worked. Ever since the construction of the church, there have been no sightings of Nero's ghost, and an alleged curse of the area seems to have gone. They say all roads lead to Rome, and the Piazza del Popolo is where that saying is said to have originated, as there are roads leading to the east, the west, the north and the south from here, and it was once the centre of Rome. The Palazzo Cupis on Via di Santa Maria dell'Anima is rumoured to be haunted by the ghost of a 17th century woman, Costanza. This young woman was said to be one of the prettiest in Rome and graced particularly beautiful hands. A sculptor made a stone copy of one of her hands and displayed it in his art studio. One day a stranger visited the studio, looking at the stone hand, said that the woman whose hand it belonged to would soon lose it. Shortly afterwards, Costanza pricked her finger while doing some needlework. The injury became infected and spread, leading to the amputation of her hand. And then suddenly, her death from septicemia. If you're near the Palazzo Cupis one night when there's a full moon, look up at the window. You might see a ghostly hand. One of the most famous ghosts in Rome is another young woman, Beatrice Cenci, and her story inspired countless paintings, poems, and plays. She was the daughter of an aristocrat called Francesco Cenci, who famously abused his wife and daughter. His family plotted to have him killed and had him pushed over the balcony to make it look like an accident. When the plot was discovered, Beatrice and her brothers and stepmother were tortured and sentenced to death. The people of Rome protested against the decision, and there was considerable public sympathy for the condemned members of the family. But on the 11th of September 1599, Beatrice and her family were led from their prisons. The men from the Corte Savella and the women from the Tor di Nona walked in chains, fearing the inhumane punishment that was set to follow. Pope Clement VIII was to offer no pardon. They were led to the scaffolding on the other side of the Ponte Sant'Angelo. One by one, members of the family were led to the block. The first up was Lucrezia. She was beheaded by a sword while the family members watched from below, poked with hot pincers. Then it was Beatrice who was forced to place her head on the block, already stained with blood. Finally, Giacomo had the mallet to his head, caving his skull in until it was flattened. He was cut into pieces and hung on display around the Ponte for the rest of the day. Only the young 12-year-old boy was spared his life, although his punishment was to sit and watch all the members of his family face their brutal deaths. He was then led back to his prison cell, but all of his belongings were sold to the Pope's own nephew. On the night before the anniversary of her death on the 11th of September 1599, Beatrice can be seen carrying her severed head as she walks across the Ponte Sant'Angelo. As well as haunting this place of her death, she is also said to haunt the house where she spent her short, tragic life. Modern inhabitants of the old family home in the Jewish ghetto, the Palazzo Cenci, have said to have seen her, as well as the music and the ghostly weeping. Finally, another famous Roman ghost allegedly appears aboard a black carriage in the dead of night and suddenly comes dashing along the Sisto Bridge, heading towards the Trastevere district. It is the ghost of Dame Olympia. She was born in Viterbo, about 50 miles north of Rome. Her first husband died young. While still in her 20s, she married the brother of a well-known cardinal, who later became Pope Innocent X. She was already rich, but by now had power, and the townsfolk did not like being ruled by someone who was once a commoner. She lived like a queen in the Piazza Navona. There is a strong legend that she and her brother-in-law had regular affairs. The Pope, something that would be a huge scandal in the church even to this day. When the Pope was on his deathbed in 1655, she knew this would mean the end of her claim to fame. She loaded 2 caseloads of gold into a carriage and left, and never returned to the piazza again. The Pope's successor, Alexander VII, exiled her and demanded the treasure to be returned. It never was. She died 2 years later of the plague. Her ghost is reportedly still seen on the Sisto Bridge. Number 3. Prague. Home to around 1.3 million people, Prague is the capital of the Czech Republic, formerly Czechoslovakia, until it broke up into 2 separate countries in the early 1990s. Cheap drinks, low price accommodation, and the historical feel mean Prague is one of the most visited tourist cities in Europe, with over 10 million people popping over here for a mini break every year. The Fausthaus is located in Charles Square, a former cattle market. The story goes that a student was so poor he couldn't afford to rent anywhere, so broke into this building. There was already a legend linked to it that the last owner was taken away by the devil himself, via a hole in the roof. The poor student slept, and the next morning found a coin in a dish nearby. He used this to buy his breakfast and his lunch. The next day, again, another coin appeared in the same place. Believing this to be the end of his financial woes, he begged the devil for more money, and upon summoning him, the devil took him up via the hole in the roof to hell. While this is just a legend, this building is built on the site of a pagan burial ground. The best ghost story is that of a Templar knight. The headless Templar can be found with his head in his hand, riding along the cobbled streets on his trotting horse, often challenging the non-faint of heart to release him from the grips of his ghostly servitude. To order for the headless Templar to be free, a living person must be strong and brave enough to seize his noble horse and grab the knight's sword and pierce it through the heart of the ghost. The headless Templar can be found wandering the picturesque and positively creepy Liliora streets between midnight and 1 a.m. A murdered nun is said to haunt St. Agnes's convent in Josephov. The child of a wealthy nobleman, this child tragically fell in love outside of her class with a poor knight. Her noble father, of course, refused to give his consent for marriage, and as a payment for her unforgivable sin, she was sent to live in St. Agnes's convent, where she still resides to this day, although more in a ghostly form. The night before her transfer to the convent, she decided to follow her heart and met with her beloved, but, alas, was met by her father, who in an outrage stabbed her for shaming him. The murdered nun has been haunting the area of St. Agnes ever since. Legend says that the ghost once appeared to a girl who wished to poison herself because she was unhappy and had a poor love affair. The murdered nun grabbed the poison from the depressed girl's hand and placed a bag of coins in it instead, enabling her to live a happy and prosperous life with her true love. If you're visiting the St. James's Church in the Old Town, be sure to look for the arm bone on the right hand side as you walk in. This is said to belong to the one-armed thief, a man who hid inside the church until it was locked up, and then came out of hiding to take as much gold and silver as he could until the statue of the Virgin Mary reached out and grabbed his arm. The next morning he was found dead with his arm ripped off. His ghost is also said to haunt the entrance. The Charles Bridge is the most famous sight in Prague and often filled with tourists every day. It was a place where heads of those executed would be displayed in tall cages. Look out for the Brunchevik statue. He was a man said to have gone to sea and fought many wild beasts. Upon his return, his wife was set to marry another man, so he put a gold ring inside a drinking chalice to let her know that he was back. He killed his love rival with his sword, and that sword is still said to be hidden in the bridge today. In the haunted fortress of Vyšehrad, where the prophetess Libuse bathed with men before tossing them to their untimely deaths off rocky cliffs, is one of Prague's most feared and bloodthirsty ghosts, the ghost of the French mayor. The mayor was the commander of the French troops who invaded Prague in 1741 during the War of the Austrian Succession and was killed by a bullet shortly before his victorious end. It is rumoured he screamed "Sacre bleu" while sinking to the ground. After his untimely death, the French mayor went off the ghostly deep end, and so to speak, and started to attack guards and soldiers alike, killing some but pardoning others that were terrified after the ordeal. They refused to speak. It was not until 1892 that the French mayor claimed his reign of terror down to the thanks of Lieutenant Pistora of Austria, who encountered the mayor and instead of showing terror, saluted him. The mayor laughed at the lieutenant, saluted him back, and went about his merry way. His frame of mind has been happy ever since, and he does not attack, he merely nods respectively at passers-by. If in Prague, be sure to pay a visit to the Sedlec Ossuary, a chapel built in the 13th century, housing the bones of 70,000 people, many of which were exhumed from nearby burial sites as victims of the Black Death. The bones have been used in an artistic way to create this amazing place. It is located in the village of Kutnia Hora, a short drive from Prague, but many tour companies will take you there. Venice. Venice is located in the northeast of Italy and is one of the most unique places you will ever visit. Whether it's a romantic weekend away or you're backpacking throughout Europe, this is a must. Set in a shallow lagoon, this man-made city was constructed likely by refugees from the nearby Roman cities such as Padua, fleeing from the Germanic and Hun invasions of the 5th century. More than 20 million tourists crowd these narrow streets each year. Famous for its gondolas and canals, this place is full of myths and legends. One of the most notorious haunted sites is the island of Praveglia. Getting here is a huge problem, as boat companies refuse to take people due to it being illegal to do so, and rumours of a curse on the island. However, some urban explorers do manage to get across. Located in the lagoon about 3 miles to the south of the main Venetian islands, often wrongly named as an island, Praveglia is actually 2 islands linked by a bridge. Originally a fort to protect the lagoon on Venice, Praveglia was used as a plague pit and quarantine station. In 1793, it's believed that over 160,000 bodies were dumped in mass graves here, and you can still see human remains to this day. In 1922, the plague quarantine buildings were turned into a mental asylum. This was abandoned in 1968. Legend talks of screams, poltergeist attacks, and strange figures of restless plague victims who make this one of the scariest places on earth. It is also said that a sadistic doctor once performed cruel experiments to torture the mentally ill. The spirits of the dead were said to have caused the doctor to fall to his death from the bell tower. In 2014, the island was sold to a businessman who plans to build a hotel here. I think I'm going to be one of the first to book up when it opens. The Palazzo Dario is said to be the most cursed building in the world. It has a habit of killing everybody who owns it. Built overlooking the Grand Canal in 1487 during the height of the Renaissance period by Giovanni Dario, who owned it for 7 years until his death, it remained in the family until the 19th century, taking 13 lives, all either murder victims or suicide or violent accidents. Both of Giovanni's children both died within 2 years of the building being complete. Englishman Radan Brown owned the building in the 19th century for just 4 years, when he ran into financial ruins and took his life. American Charles Briggs killed himself shortly after his partner did the same thing, just months after moving into the Palazzo Dario. Famous tenor Mario Del Marco bought the property in 1964, but the artist who was driving to meet him to sign over the property crashed in Mestre, dying in the accident. In the 1970s, the Count of Turin, Filippo Giordano delle Lance, bought the palazzo but was murdered by his lover Raoul Blasic, who later died a violent death after fleeing to London. Kit Lambert, the manager of the rock band The Who, bought the palace, but is said to have stayed in nearby hotels to escape the many ghosts he claimed infested the house. Fabrizio Ferrari and his sister bought the building in the 1980s and soon fell into financial hardship. His sister was killed in a car crash. The last owner was Raoul Gardini, who committed suicide in 1993. At the turn of the 21st century, Woody Allen considered buying the Dario, but changed his mind after reading all of the strange accounts of tragic deaths connected to it. As recently as 2002, The Who's original bass player John Entwistle suffered a heart attack a week after renting the place. Some locals believe the cause of the curse may be the fact that the building was constructed over a Templar cemetery, which, due to the settling of the foundation, means the structure visibly tilts to the right. Another famous Venetian ghost is Luzzo, a 16th century famous Italian painter who was sent to haunt the Cassin degli. He killed himself here over a failed love, his ghost often seen wandering around the rooms upstairs. The story continues with a murder which happened in 1950. A young woman was cut into pieces, put in a trunk and thrown into the lagoon. Her body was discovered many years later, and the palace was considered to be a haunted place, never to be inhabited again. Even the fishermen avoid sailing into its waters. The most famous site of Venice is San Marco, and it has a story to tell. Those two pillars are often said to be cursed. Even before they were erected, they were transported to Venice from Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and the ship carrying them tipped over, with the third column sinking into the sea, where it still remains to this day. The space between the two remaining were later used as a main execution site for many hundreds of thieves, enemies of the Republic and murderers. One famous man executed here was a butcher called Biasio, who used to serve dinners containing body parts of children he had murdered to add more taste to his meals. In the 16th century, a nobleman called Loredan fell in love and married the dog's niece. Loredan was unfortunately a horribly jealous man who later accused his wife of adultery. She denied it. He chased her from her home with a sword and ended up beheading her in front of the Doge himself. As punishment, the Doge ordered Loredan to carry his dead wife's body to the Pope in Rome and ask for forgiveness. The Pope refused to see him, so he had to walk back to Venice, and distraught, he threw himself into the lagoon. His ghost can be reportedly seen at the Campiello del Reme at the Grand Canal, coming out of the water, carrying his wife's head. They say on foggy nights a small floating coffin with 4 candles on the corners appears in the waters lapping the island of San Michele, where a cemetery is based. At this place, on the 29th of November 1904, a water bus was carrying passengers around Venice, collided with a gondola. Several of the gondola's passengers drowned. Among them was a small girl, Giuseppina Gabrielle Carmelo, whose body was never found. It is believed she is warning people of the dangers in the fog. Murano is a pretty island just off Fondamente Nove in Venice. The island is famous for its centuries of glass-making traditions, and for something else too. Namely, Murano's church of Santa Maria and San Donato has a possession of some dragon bones. Hung behind the church's altar, the bones are said to be that of a dragon which was slain by the hand of San Donato himself. Well, recently it has been established that the bones are actually from a whale. Finally, this is the Palazzo Mastalli. There is a legend that 3 very rich merchants named Riobar, Afani and Sandy tried to sell a poor quality fabric to a Venetian lady for a large amount of money in the year 1100 AD. After the fraud was discovered, the woman gave them a curse which turned them into stone statues. You can admire them in the square just behind the palace. Visiting Venice is an absolute must. London. One of the largest cities in Europe, 19 million people will visit London each year, mainly to see the famous sights such as Westminster, the London Eye, Buckingham Palace and Tower Bridge. It's famed worldwide for the royal family, the iconic red buses, London cabs and red phone boxes. But London has a dark history, going back over 2,000 years. London is famed for the Underground. It's the first of its kind built anywhere in the world. It was a piece of genius engineering by the Victorians. But this Underground has its fair share of ghost stories. Many stations here are abandoned, and millions of tourists and commuters will walk through the stations with incredible ghost stories. Covent Garden is said to be haunted by a tall man in a hat seen wandering around after dark. It is said to be the ghost of William Terrace, murdered in 1897 at the Adelphi Theatre just along the road. While the station was built after his death, he was a regular at the local bakery that stood on its site. People have identified William's ghost after recognising his face in old photos. The ghost of Anne Naylor is said to haunt a spot in Farringdon Station where her body was found in 1758. She was an apprentice hat maker, and she is blamed for screams heard coming from the area. Other haunted stations include Liverpool Street, which staff regularly see people walking around on CCTV when the station is empty. Bank Station is said to be built on an old burial site, leading many to experience feelings of sadness and strong emotions. And Elephant and Castle also have stories of people being followed and hearing footsteps. Much of the underground was used as air raid shelters during World War II, and Bethnal Green was the scene of a horrible tragedy in 1943. An anti-aircraft gun went off accidentally, causing a stampede, killing 173 people. Screams, children crying, and the feeling of panic have all been experienced here. Highgate Cemetery has over 170,000 graves, including many famous dead celebrities. Douglas Adams, the author of A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, TV presenter Jeremy Beadle, Karl Marx, Malcolm McLaren, Gene Simmons and George Michael are here. The cemetery gained popularity in the 1970s through accounts of its vampire sightings. This is one of the top places for ghost hunters to go, with strange sightings still reported to this day. This photograph was taken in St Botolph's Church in 1982 by Chris Brackley. This was before digital cameras, and despite the negatives undergoing multiple analysis, it was decided that the photograph was not faked and is not a double exposure. A few years later, a builder working on the wall in the crypt below the church found a series of coffins and disturbed the lid of one containing a body with a well-preserved face, very similar to the face in Chris's photograph. This remains one of the best photographic pieces of paranormal evidence. 50 Berkeley Square. This infamous address has been dubbed the most haunted house in London since the 1900s. They say that the attic is haunted by the tortured spirit of a young woman who committed suicide there. She threw herself from the top floor window after the abuse from her evil uncle. In 1879, a maid went mad after spending the night in the house, dying in an insane asylum the very next day. 8 years later, a sailor tripped and fell to his death after fleeing in terror from an unknown horror residing in the house. While in London, do the Jack the Ripper ghost walk and visit the locations of the most famous serial killer in the world. Also make sure to walk through Greenwich Foot Tunnel and see if you can see the Victorian man and woman walking behind you at night, but nobody knows who the ghosts belong to. London is famous for its West End theatres, and we all know every old theatre has a ghost. See a show at the Haunted Theatre Royal on Drury Lane, said to be the most haunted theatre in the world. According to tradition, seeing one of the theatre's many ghosts is a sign of good luck for the actor or producer. As the oldest theatre site in London still in use, the Theatre Royal is home to a whole cast of apparitions. The mortal remains of a notorious man in grey ghost were found within a bricked up passage deep in the bowels of the theatre in 1848. Little is known about the unhappy fate of the spirit, who is now a frequent sight in the theatre. The Theatre Royal is home to the ghost of a notorious actor, Charles Macklin, who once killed a man during an argument over a wig. With over 500 years of history, Hampton Court has been the stage of the deaths of Henry VIII's wives. It's no surprise that visitors have experienced many hauntings throughout the years. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, has given the Haunted Gallery its chilling name. She can be seen dressed in white, floating down the gallery towards the door of the royal pew. As she reaches it, she turns back and screams until passing through the door. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, also haunts Hampton Court Palace. She has been seen walking the cobbled grounds of Clock Court. On the anniversary of the birth of her son Edward, she is said to ascend the stairs leading to the Silver Stick Gallery, dressed in a white robe, carrying a candle. When the church of Hampton Court Palace was pulled down, the remains of the Lady in Grey were disturbed. Roused from her eternal slumber, the spirit returned to her original rooms, attending her spinning wheel. Over the years, many people have heard the sound of a lonely spinning wheel as the Lady in Grey, unable to rest, continues her work until the end of time. From 1100 to 1952, the Tower of London was a prison for people particularly disliked by the royal family. Prisoners here were usually beheaded in the most grisly and public fashion. But it seems that even this did not release the unfortunate souls from their imprisonment. Perhaps the most famous haunting of the tower is that of Anne Boleyn, the beheaded wife of the king and serial husband Henry VIII. Many who have claimed to see Anne Boleyn's spirit say she walks with her head tucked beneath her arm. Others have spotted her from the courtyard staring out of the window of the room in which she was held captive by her maniac husband. The ghosts of other historical figures include Guy Fawkes, Lady Jane Grey, and Henry VI have also been sighted. Less famous prisoners have also gained notoriety in the afterlife for their refusal to leave the scene of their suffering. If you stand on the threshold of St John's Chapel, you will smell the perfume of the White Tower's White Lady, who can be seen above you through the windows of the tower. Why not do a pub crawl in some of the city's oldest drinking public houses and take a walk on Hampstead Heath at night, where some of the most famous ghosts include Dick Turpin, a highwayman executed in 1739.